All right, good morning everybody, and welcome to the YouTube live stream. My name is Devon. I'm the Product Service and Support Coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we'll be going over everyone's favorite task, the Stroop task. So, we are just going to be building a very simple Stroop task from the bottom up. For those of you who are familiar with our experiment library, we're actually going to be making that version of the Stroop task. So it'll be keyboard input. We're going to be pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The colors are going to be green, red, yellow, and blue. And that's all we're going to do today. It's going to be pretty easy. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you guys want. I'm always happy to answer any questions you guys might have, especially if you have design questions like, hey, why were you doing that? Could you repeat that step again? Anything like that. As always, feel free to ask any questions. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So from our eStudio interface here, we're going to select a blank template. I'm going to go ahead and click OK and just wait a second while it loads. All a blank template is just your basic starting point of ePrime. So if you look in your Experiment Explorer over here on the side of the window, you can see that we have our user script, our full script, and a session proc. That represents, obviously, a blank version of ePrime. So go ahead and double click on our session proc, which is our experimental timeline, to open it up in our workspace, which is this area right here. And as always, the first thing we're going to add is instructions, just so participants know exactly what they're going to be doing in this task. Instructions in this case are just going to be all text-based. So let's go ahead and take the text display object from the toolbox, and we'll drag it and drop it into our procedural timeline here, and we'll make sure that the purple arrows are on the far left side, so it's the very first thing. Now, as always, I like the name of each object to reflect its function. In this case, we're going to be presenting participants with instructions, so I'm going to change the name of this from text display 1 to instructions. Now, I got there just by clicking on it once, right-clicking, and clicking rename. I'm just going to type instructions. Now, the one thing we recommend whenever making ePrime experiments is to save as often and as frequently as possible. So before I even go ahead and jump into this, I'm actually going to save my experiment. Click Save. I'm just in the My Experiments 3.0 folder. If you've been following along with our YouTube live streams, here are some of my other live stream experiments. This one's just going to be called Stroop Task. I'm going to hit Enter. It's just going to save as eStudio 3.0 files right there. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save. So now that I've made my instructions and saved my experiment as Stroop task, I'm going to go ahead and actually edit my instructions. So we'll double click on it to open it in the workspace. I'm going to click on the center here just to realign this little cursor. And I'm going to start typing some very basic instructions into here. So first, I'm going to welcome participants to the experiment, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lay out the task. So tell them what they're going to be doing here. So I'll type that out quickly and then read it back to you guys. All right. You will be shown a word. The word will either be colored green. Oh, I'm going to spell green and not the word gree. There we go. It will be either colored green, red, yellow, or blue. And now I want to actually lay out the button mappings for participants, because if you're familiar with the Stroop task, what participants have to do is they have to respond to the color that the word is written in and not the word itself. So for example, they'll be shown the word red, but it will appear in blue, so they'll have to respond blue. So I'm actually going to double click here to click Enter, and then I'm just going to lay out the button mapping for participants quickly. And I'm going to space out the end word. There we go. All right. So if the word is green, press the 1 key. If the word is red, press the 2 key. If the word is yellow, press the 3 key, and if the word is blue, press the 4 key. So that's just the button mapping for participants. So now that they know, they need to map the actual color of the word and not the word itself. I'm just going to write a quick sentence here. Press space to begin. All right, so now that I have my instructions, they know what the task is going to be, and they know the button mapping. I'm going to keep this on the screen indefinitely until the participant opts to press the spacebar to advance from this text display object. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this properties page icon in the upper left-hand corner. Click on the duration input tab, and we'll change duration from infinite to from its default value to infinite here, just so it stays on the screen indefinitely. I'm going to change my data logging here to time audit only, and if I click apply and hop over to my timing tab here, or here my logging tab, you're going to see exactly what I'm saving. So I'm saving, in this case, the onset delay, the onset time, and the onset to onset time. That way I know how long participants have been on this slide object. I'm also going to click add here. I'm going to add what's called an input mask. An input mask in ePrime is like saying a response device. So how are participants responding to this text display object? Are they responding with the keyboard and a button press? Are they responding by clicking on the mouse, or are they using a button device? And since this doesn't have a button device, that one doesn't actually apply. But in this case, we are going to use keyboard because they're going to be pushing space to continue. So go ahead and click OK. And in allowable, I'm actually going to type space. I don't need to type anything into correct because the only thing participants can click in this case is space. They can't press any of the other buttons on the keys. They can only press space. So I'm going to keep that blank because it's assumed now that every response is a correct response. So I'll click apply and OK. And then we're good. That's all we need to do for this instruction screen. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make our block list. This experiment is actually going to contain two different blocks, or in ePrime, types of trials. The first type of trials that we're going to do is our practice trials. Instead of using words for the practice trials, we're actually going to be using 4 X's on the screen. And those 4 X's are either going to be colored red, green, blue, or yellow. That way they have the key mapping down. Because right now, it's just a really quick sentence that says, hey, if it's green, press 1, if it's red, press 2. It doesn't actually do a good job of showing them exactly what that mapping is, and they don't get to practice it. And what you're going to have in your data then, if you just jump them right into the task, you can have this learning effect. So the RT time, or the reaction time, to each of these words is going to start out very, very slow because participants are just learning the button mapping. And then what you're going to find is it's going to ramp up significantly at the end once they actually understand the button mapping. That's less than ideal because it's going to give you some bad data. So that's why we want to put a practice trial in there, just so when participants are learning the task, it's not part of the critical data. This isn't like the critical part of the task yet. So in order to separate my task into 2 different types of trials, a practice type of trial and a critical type of trial, I need to make something called a block list. And it's just a list that sits towards the top of the experiment, and it says, okay, there are 2 paths participants can go down. They can go down the practice path, and then they're going to go down the critical path. So that's exactly how we're going to set it up. So we'll take a list object from our toolbox here, and we'll put it just after our instructions. I'm going to rename list 1 to block list, and I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to double click on it. Now here I'm going to make 2 procedures. Since I said participants are going to be practicing first, and then they're going to be doing the critical task second, my first one, or my first procedure that I'm going to make is called prac block proc, and hit enter. It says it does not exist. Would I like to create it? Of course I'm going to hit yes. And it said, would you like to make it this procedure default value for newly created levels? I'm going to click no because the next level I'm going to make is actually going to be just my normal block proc or my critical trials. So I'm going to click no here. I'm going to jump back into my list, and I'm going to click the down button here. This down button is add level. I'm only adding 1 level because I would like the practice, the entirety of the practice, to only run once, and I would like the entirety of my critical trials to only run once as well. So for my critical trials here, I'm going to just call this block proc and hit enter. Again, it says it doesn't exist, but I'd like to create it. Of course, I'm going to hit yes. So now in my block list, I have prac block proc and block proc. Also, prac block proc is a bit of a tongue twister, so that's always fun if you want to use that at parties and sound like the lamest person there. It's pretty fun though. Alright, so after prac block proc, I want to actually make my trials. I want to hold all of my independent variables in a list object. And I want that list object to be able to select the trial that they're on. I want it to be able to use it to present those 4 X's I had talked about. And then I also want to use it to randomize the colors that are going to be presented to participants. And I'm actually going to show 2 different ways to present different colors to participants in these different colored X's. One way is a really long way that I'm going to demonstrate first, just to show you logically how to set it up there. And then I'm going to demonstrate a technique that we have called nested lists, or nesting lists. when using a nested list, it allows e prime to make that cross-section of variables, and that's going to make more sense in a second. So I first have to make my list object. So we'll take a list object from the toolbox and just add it to my prac block proc. I will change it from list1 to prac trial list. Again, name reflects function. This is practice, so it's going to be called prac. And then this is the list object that's at the trial level of my experiment, so prac trial list. I'll double click on it to open it in the workspace here. Now for procedure, I'm just going to type trial proc. And I would like to create it, and I would like to make the default value for newly created levels. Now, I'm calling this trial proc and not prac trial proc, and you're going to see why in a little while. It's going to make a lot more sense once I start doing my critical trials. So in my practice trial list here, I want to make a couple of attributes. The first attribute I want to make here is going to just be the word or the stimulus that's going to appear to participants. So I'm going to click on this button up here that's just called add attribute to make an attribute in my list object, and I'm going to call this one stimword. Oops, I don't spell word right. There we go. And since I said this is practice, and participants are just going to see 4 X's, I'm just going to do this. And now stimword appear, or now this is what's going to appear for stimword once I actually reference this. Now I had mentioned that I want this to show up in different colors. I want this to show up red, I want it to show up, yellow, green, and blue, and I want participants to respond that way. So if I actually click this add attribute, I'm going to go ahead and make this one word color. I'll call it stim color, just to be consistent with that experiment library sample we have. And the stim color for this one is just going to be green. And if you think back to the instructions screen, I'll go ahead and tab back. If the word is green, press the 1 key. So that makes our correct response to this 1. So if I click on add attribute, I'm going to make an attribute called correct. And it's going to actually just have 1 as the correct response here. So now what I can do is I can add 3 more levels. Now for these 3 levels, these are going to represent all of the different colors that I'm going to present this stim word in. So stim word here, XXX. So I'm just going to copy that. I can either type that all the way out, or if I take my cursor here, put it in the little bottom right-hand corner of the cell, you'll see that fill handle come up. And if you just drag and drop all the way down there, it'll just copy and paste all of those rows. My stim color is, of course, going to change per trial. So I'm going to do green, then I'll do red, then yellow, and then blue. And I'm just tabbing down through those by typing the word and then hitting enter. It'll make that little cell jump down to the next one. And then if you remember back to the instructions, a response of red is 2, a response of yellow is 3, and a response of blue is 4. So that's all I have to do. Now if I want to present this a different time to participants, so this will run through these colors, red, yellow, blue, and green, in the order presented here, so green, red, yellow, and blue. If I want to add this again, what I'll have to do is I'll have to actually add 4 more trials, and then I'll have to copy and paste all of this just like this. And what that does is that actually ends up bulking up my list object. And as you can see, I actually typed 1 down, so I can just delete this row if I want to. And by highlighting the 5 here, this is the row I want to get rid of, and clicking on this remove levels button. If I remove this level, it'll actually get rid of that extra row that I added in there. So now I have, green, red, yellow, blue, green, red, yellow, blue, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all of these X's here. This is, like I said, the first way to program this list. This isn't using the nested property at all. This is just using the standard, okay, I'm going to print everything out. And for this sample, it's not actually that bad. I only have 4 different things that I'm changing. So I'm changing the color that these are presented in. But let's think about our critical trials a little bit. This is actually going to grow exponentially once we start adding different stimuli in here. Instead of just the X's, we're going to actually add the color of the word in the next trial list that we have. So this is actually going to grow pretty exponentially. So we're going to have the word green written in green, red, yellow, and blue. Then the word red written in green, red, yellow, and blue. And then the word yellow written in green, red, yellow, and blue, and so on and so forth. And that's actually going to make this list expand a lot, and it's not going to be as nice and neat as it looks right here. It's actually going to be much, much larger. So instead of making this gigantic list object in E prime and taking all that time to spell all of this stuff out and think through the logic of all that, you can actually make E prime do this random sampling or create this intersection of stimuli for you. To do that, like I said, we're going to do something called a nested list. The nested list obviously refers to this nested column here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete these bottom 5 levels here, and you can do that by highlighting, and I highlighted all of them, by taking my cursor until it has this little sideways arrow, holding it into the first row that I want to change, and then just dragging it down to the last row I want to change. And I'm going to click on this Remove Levels button, and it will remove those levels, and I want to resize this one because it looks a little clipped. So all I have to do is double click on this, and it'll resize it. So now what I want to do is I want to make a nested list, and my nested list is actually going to represent the color that's going to be presented to participants. So it's going to be this half of my list object. I'm going to keep stimword on here, but I'm actually going to take this part of it, and I'm going to put it in my nested list. So I want to make a list that's going to hold the color values. So I'm going to call this color list and hit enter. It says, does exist, would you like to create it? I'm going to click yes. Now if you look over in the Experiment Explorer over here in the Structure tab, you're going to notice this is how nested lists are set up. You're going to see that I have my prac trial list in its normal location, but then between it and my procedure, this color list, or this nested list called color list, has put itself in here. This means that trial procedure can now access everything from both trial list and from color list when it's running in E prime. So I'm actually just going to take nested list and make it apply to, or this color list in my nested column, and make it apply to every level here. And then I'm going to double click on it to open it. Now nested lists are exactly the same as your normal list. Just note that I'm actually not going to fill out anything for procedure. The procedure that this is associated with is the same procedure on its parent list, or the non-nested list on which it can be found. So this color list still applies to trial proc, even though in color list it doesn't look like it has anything in procedure. That's just how nested lists work in E prime. Now what I had mentioned is I'm actually going to have my stim color and my correct response in color list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight them again like I had, where you take your cursor until it has a little downward arrow, and just highlight both of those rows at the same time. And I'm just going to copy them by clicking Control-C on the keyboard. Then I'm going to hop back into color list, and I'm going to make one more attribute. I'm just going to call it attribute 1 for now. I'll rename this later. But if I highlight this by clicking on that same down arrow and clicking Control-V in order to paste it, it's going to auto-paste all of my values in there. And now everything is matched up the way that I want it to. I have green, red, and yellow, and blue, and that lines up to 1, 2, 3, and 4 on my attribute 2 list, or on my attribute 2. So now I need to rename this from attribute 1 to stim color, and I need to rename attribute 2 to correct. Now, if you've been following along, you'll notice that I have both stim color and correct in my color list and my prac trial list. Now that's less than ideal. We only need these values once, and we don't want any one of these to overwrite the other one. So we're actually going to remove it from prac trial list. So I'm going to hold this little downward arrow here, drag it off to the right so both stim color and correct are highlighted, and then I'm going to delete them by clicking on this remove attribute button here. It says you want to remove selected attributes. I'm going to say yes, and it's gone. So now, even though all that appears on here is stimword, E prime still has access to that correct answer column, or that correct column, and that stim color column. And if you look here, it's going to access it on every trial, and will access a different level of it on every trial. Now the one thing we need to change though is, let's go into our color list here, and you're going to see that it's actually going to display green, red, yellow, and then blue every time over and over again. That's less than ideal, because if it does green, red, yellow, and blue a couple of times over and over, participants are going to catch on, oh, it did green, the next one's red. And you're going to see a really, really sharp decrease in the reaction time. And that's less than ideal, because, I mean, obviously participants are going to be able to predict what's next, and it's not actually getting at the effect, it's just their ability to memorize things. So we want to change this selection method from sequential to random. To do that, go ahead and click on the Properties page button up here. Click on the Selection tab, and we will change order from sequential to random. We'll click Apply and OK, and that's all we need to do to set up this color list. Let's jump back into our practice trial list. If you notice, our practice trial right now is only 4 samples, or 1 cycle of the entire list. That's enough to run through every one of the colors in our color list once. I don't think that's necessarily good practice. It does a good job of showing them how to orient their fingers and how to actually push the buttons, but it doesn't do a good job of actually mapping the colors to the buttons that they're pressing. So I'm actually going to add or change one of the properties here. If you click on the properties page icon and then click on the reset exit tab, I am actually going to exit the list after 2 cycles of 4 samples. So if I, in this exit list here, make sure after this top one, so after 1 cycle of 4 sample, I'm going to change that from 1 to 2. So it's after 2 cycles, and you're going to notice that this is now 8 samples. So this is now going to run through every color twice instead of once, which is exactly what I want. Alright, so now that I have that set up, I'm actually going to close all of my tabs. I like to close all of the tabs up here in all of the different windows just to make sure everything is nice and neat. I usually do that when I switch from one procedure to another, just for consistency's sake. So click on Window and click on Close All. It will close them all, and that's a pretty satisfying animation. I'll click on the trial proc here. And the first thing I'm going to do is present participants with a fixation. The fixation is just going to orient their eyes to the center of the screen so they know that this is where they're going to be looking for the stimulus when it appears. The fixation is just going to be a very simple plus sign in the middle of a white background. So I'm just going to use a text display object. You can absolutely use a slide object, but it's not entirely necessary. So I'm just going to take text display, and I'm going to put it in my procedural timeline here. I'm going to change it from the word text display 1 to fixation. And now for fixation, I am just in the very center of it going to hit the plus sign. For those of you who aren't familiar with the way that text displays work, this looks like it's going to show up at the very top of my screen instead of in the middle. But if I click on the properties page icon here, you're going to see that align vertical and align horizontal are both set to center. This means that whenever it runs, despite it showing up at the very top of the text display object, it's actually going to show up in the very center, and that's exactly what we want. I'm going to click on the duration input tab here. And I'm going to change the duration from 1,000 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds, just so it doesn't show up for a very long time. And I'm, of course, going to change data logging from none to time audit only. If you look at some of my past YouTube live streams, I talk about some of the horror stories I went through as an undergraduate and why I always set that to time audit only. Definitely give those a look, because I do set those to time audit only for a very important reason. I'm going to go ahead and click Apply to save these changes and click OK. And that's all I need for my fixation, just a simple plus sign in the very center of the screen. So now is where the bulk of all of my edits happen, and that's to this object that I'm going to call stimulus. I'm going to make it by taking a slide object and putting it just after fixation. I'm going to rename it to stimulus. Now this is what's going to display the stimulus to participants, but on this slide I'm actually going to also reinforce my button mapping. At the very bottom of the slide I want to have all of the different colors that participants could respond to, so green, red, yellow, and blue, and I want to have their appropriately mapped keys in the middle of those colors. Just so participants know, oh, this is red, okay, I'm selecting red, and red is going to be 2, those kinds of things. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on stimulus to open it in my workspace. Now the very first thing I want to do is I want to show participants the actual stimulus to which they're responding. In this case it's going to be stimword. And I just opened that up just to show you here, and it's going to be these 4 X's. So in order to access this information within this list object, I need to make an attribute reference, which means to reference the name of this heading here. So all I need to do is take a text display object, or a slide text sub object, put it anywhere I want on the screen. It's going to end up being in the center anyway, and then double click on it to edit its properties. I don't like the word text. I don't think it's good, so I'll click delete to delete it. And then I'm going to make an attribute reference. To make an attribute reference, all you need is the name of the attribute, surrounded by those square brackets. And if you actually click on the left square bracket, this thing that we have called a trib sense actually appears. And a trib sense is going to show you all of the attributes defined in your experiment and exactly where they're set. So correct, you can see that correct is defined in color list, which is a list item. And correct is that correct answer, or stim color is defined in color list. But what we need in this case is stimword. Stimword is defined in prac trial list as a list item. That's exactly what we need, so we'll click on it once. And if you click on it once, it makes an already properly formatted attribute reference. So now I don't need to make sure that my attribute reference is formatted correctly. It already does that work for me. So I'm actually going to center this on the screen, and to do that, I'm going to click on it once and click on the Properties page icon. I'm going to click on the Frame tab, and I'm actually going to change the position along the X and Y axis here from its current value to center. Now, the reason why I'm actually doing this in relative terms instead of clicking 50% or instead of setting this to an exact pixel value, because you can set this to an exact pixel value, is because if I take this experiment and port it to other computers, the pixel value might not equal the center of the screen if I don't have my display set up exactly the same between computers. I'm putting in relative position or relative terms here, so center. So no matter what computer, what resolution I run this on, this always shows up in the center of the screen, and I think that's very important. So I'm going to click Apply to save those changes. Now I want to go to the General tab and change one more thing. I want to change this four-color property. Now the four-color property relates to the color of the text on the screen. Right now it's set to its default of black, but since this is a Stroop task, I need to change that. And this is of course going to be changed to an attribute reference to that stim color attribute that lives in our color list here. So if I make a left bracket here and type color list and then do a right bracket, what this is going to do is it's going to actually make these words appear in blue. That's a little signal for ePrime to say, okay, I know this is an attribute reference, I know color list isn't the actual value that you're going to do, I'm going to look for this at runtime. So now we know that we've made a correct attribute reference because it showed up in blue. And click Apply and OK to save these changes. Now the last thing I want to do on the slide object is, like I said, I want that mapping at the bottom. I want a little square that's green, and I want it to have a 1 in the middle so they know that green is 1. I want the same same square, but this time red. So I'm actually going to make those along the bottom of my screen. So these are actually better made in slide text sub-objects. You could do images. If you have images, that's perfectly acceptable, but I don't have these images, so I'm just going to do a slide text object. And I'll put it at the bottom of the screen here, and I'm going to resize it a little bit because that is quite large. Alright, so I'm actually going to change the text on here from the word text to 1. And if I go into the properties display or the properties page of this text2 object, I want to change the background color. So for color changes the font, the back color changes the background color. I'm going to change it from white to green. So now participants are reminded, if the color of this word is green, to press 1. And I'm going to make the exact same thing for 2, 3, and 4. Now what I can do is I can make a text display object and then try to resize it to the same size as this. But if you noticed, when I actually made this side text sub object, I didn't size it very scientifically. I just kind of moved around this this little drag handle here until it looked like I wanted it to look like, until it looked like, oh, this is the size I want. I could go into the properties page here, and I could look at the frame, and I can say, okay, well, it's a width of 15 and a height of 19. I need to make that for every new text display object I want. Or I could just copy paste. So if you highlight it and click Control C, and then click off of it and click Control V, it's not going to look immediately obvious what happened, but it actually made an exact copy of it. So if I highlight the upmost instance of this, and then just drag it off to the right here, you're going to see that I now have 2 copies of this. And I'm going to do this a couple more times, because I ultimately have 4 possible responses. And right now it looks like I have 4 ones, and that's clearly not true. So we'll double click on this, and I will change that from 1 to 2. And if you remember our instructions, pressing the 2 key means that the word is red. So I want to change my background color from green to red. There, so now green response is 1, a red response is 2, and we'll keep going for 3 and 4. Now I can change the text by double clicking on this and then changing the text there. Or if you click on it once here and click on the side sub-object properties page button, you can see that I can change the text from right here. So I'm actually going to change that to 3, and then the back color for 3 is going to be yellow. Click Apply and OK, and it makes all those changes all at once. And then the last one I need to make changes to is this text 5. So the text here is going to be 4. And the back color is actually going to be blue. And there we go. Now my button mapping is on the bottom of the screen for participants to reference if they need it, and then the stimulus is going to appear at the top of the screen. The only thing I haven't done yet is actually set up my input mask. So participants have all these really nice things to look at, but there's nothing for them to respond to. So we'll click on this Properties page button, click on the Duration Input tab, and I'm going to change the duration from 1,000 milliseconds to 3,000. So they have 3 seconds to respond to this. I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to add a keyboard input mask because participants will be responding with the keyboard. Now, their allowable in this case is going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. They can only press those on the keyboard, and I don't want the option of the participants to accidentally click anything else. I just want to restrict them to just those keys on the keyboard. So for allowable, just type 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I know this looks like 1,234, and it looks like that might be the answer, but if you click on this Advanced tab, you're going to see that the max count for this particular input mask is 1. So this means of 1, 2, 3, and 4, participants can only ever click one of those 4 keys. If you want them to press 2 of those keys, so if you want them to hit 12 or 14 or 23 or 34, then I change my max count to 2. But in this case, they're only clicking 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to this. And if you remember from our color list, there is actually a correct answer for each trial. So this is just going to be another attribute reference to that attribute I made earlier called correct. So I'm actually just going to change the property or the correct property to an attribute reference to my correct attribute that I made in my color list here. The time limit is going to be same as duration. This is a place where people sometimes get mixed up in ePrime because time limit and duration sound pretty similar, but they're actually very different. So duration is how long something appears on the screen, and I want this to appear on the screen for 3,000 milliseconds. Time limit relates to how long participants have to respond to this object once it appears on the screen. I can make the time limit greater than my duration if I want participants to respond to this object after it's left the screen. Or I can actually make it so it's shorter. So I can make it so only during the first 1,000 milliseconds they can respond to this, and then every response after 1,000 milliseconds doesn't count if I want. But if I keep it the same as duration, participants will be able to respond to this as long as it's on the screen. Now, if I click away from this, you're going to see ePrime yell at me. If I click, let's say here, it's going to say, you specified a value in correct input, but have not turned on data logging. We recommend setting data logging to standard, which records response and timing data. Would you like to set data logging to standard? That is an awesome error message. I wish I had as an undergraduate. I'm going to go ahead and click yes, and as you can see, it's actually just going to change my data logging from none to standard. I'm going to keep pre-release the same as duration. What pre-release does is it actually allows ePrime to load the next object in the procedure while this one's being processed. We don't necessarily need it for this case, but it's not going to mess anything up either, so I'm going to keep it at its default. And I'm going to go ahead and click Apply because those are all the changes I need, and click OK to close out of the dialog. So now my stimulus is all set up correctly. So the next thing I want for participants is I just want a feedback display. I want participants to know whether or not they've responded correctly or incorrectly. So if I jump back to my trial proc here, I'm going to take a feedback display from my toolbox, drag it and drop it, and I'm just going to rename this to feedback. Feedback display 1 is a perfectly acceptable name as well because the name does actually reflect the function, but I just think feedback looks cleaner. Alright, if I double click on this, it's going to look like a very familiar thing. It looks a lot like the slide object, only it is a pre-rendered slide object. So all of these properties are already set. These things here, the @RT and @ACC.mean, these are actually feedback display shortcut macros. So this is actually going to be the response time, or RT value, for the current response that was being made. And it actually takes the mean of all of your accuracy ratings and presents it to you here. Now, if you look at the very bottom of the slide, we have these things called slide states. The slide states in the feedback display object are going to change based on participants' accuracy in responding to this object. So if they respond correctly, this slide state, or this part of the slide, is going to appear. If they respond incorrectly, this slide state, or this part of the slide, is going to appear. And if they don't actually respond to stimulus and they time out after 300 or 3,000 milliseconds, they're going to see no response detected. Now, I only really need to change one property of a feedback display object. They're pretty easy. If I click on the properties page icon here, I go to the input object name property. The input object name is to which object am I judging for this feedback. So if I click on input object name, I want to change it to stimulus. That's the only thing that has a possible correct or incorrect answer for it, so that's all I need there. Display name, I only have one display in my experiment called display, so I don't necessarily need to change that. I'm going to click apply on OK, and that's all I need for my feedback display. Alright, so now it looks like I have my practice trials already set up, but let's go ahead and run them just to make sure that they actually present themselves the way I want them to. So I'm going to click save to save those changes. Now instead of running it just in the ePrime's normal mode, I'm actually going to change it in this windowed mode, or run in this windowed mode. The windowed mode allows me to change the clock scale so I can run it up to 4 times its normal speed. I don't necessarily want that since I want to be interacting with this on the fly. I do want to enable Experiment Advisor Report, so this will let me know if I have any potential timing or experiment design related errors, so I want that to run. And then what's the scale of the window that I'm going to run this in? I'm going to keep it right there. Now we have this Quick Start Guide at the bottom. The Quick Start Guide allows you to select what objects you want to run during the procedure. I'm going to run all of them. I'm just going to click Test. I'll keep my subject and session number at 1. And let's make sure this works the way I want it to. So my introduction, or my instruction slide looks good. I'm going to hit space and it's going to start my trials. So I hit space. And as you can see, what's happening here is it's not actually showing up in a color. So I have all my colors mapped here. I have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and every response is of course incorrect because the background color isn't changing correctly. And if I actually pause my experiment here, I can actually take a look. This is a way to troubleshoot. If I take a look in this experiment window here, I can scroll down and see what my attributes are. So I have my stimulus. Stim color in this case for this trial is set to blue. So I know that stim color is actually being set to blue correctly. My response and RT haven't happened yet. My stim word is set to that. So this is being set to blue, but if I look over here, that's not actually appearing in blue. So we'll have to go ahead and troubleshoot that once this is over. So I could run through the rest of it, or I could actually just click abort and I'll get out of the experiment quickly. So return it by user, that is completely fine. So let's hop back into my stimulus object here. On my color list, I have stim color set to green, red, yellow, and blue. We saw that that was being logged correctly. Correct is being set correctly there. So go into my stimulus object, click on text display 1, and look at the properties. So for color looks like it is being set to color list. Now if you look, color list is actually the name of the list object. It's not the name of the color that it's going to be changing to. So that's where my error is. And I knew that and could tell that based on the fact that color, my stim color was changing correctly, but it wasn't actually changing here. And that's how, or one of the ways that those windows just kind of demonstrate, hey, this is what we're doing, or this is what we're doing correctly. It shows you what's going on in the experiment actively. So if I change this attribute reference that I make here to stim color instead of color list, click apply and OK, I'm going to run it one more time just to see this change happen. I'm going to keep this at 1 and 1 for my subject and session. And now this is showing up correctly. That one showed up in green, this one's showing up in blue. I actually accidentally hit the wrong button there. This one's showing up in yellow. So now this looks like exactly how I want it to look. So this is just one of the ways that this experiment window here is going to be really helpful for you. So not only is it going to show you exactly what your data is going to look like whenever you're running it, but it's also a really great troubleshooting step for whenever something doesn't look right in your experiment. I'll go ahead and click abort because I know things are working properly now. I'll hop back into eStudio. And now that I have my practice list made, all I need to do is fill in this block proc down here. So this block proc is actually going to contain the critical trials for my experiment. What I want to do is I want to actually make a copy of this prac trial list, because this prac trial list already has everything that I need in it. And there's a fixation, a stimulus, a feedback object, and this nested color list. The only thing I really need to change about this is this stim word property. So instead of having to remake all of that from scratch, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to double click on block proc here. Ooh, words are hard. Double click on block proc here. I'm going to take prac trial list and copy it using Control-C. Now, if I click on my block proc here and paste it using Control-V, what's going to say, it'll say this object you're pasting contains child objects. Would you like to paste all of the child objects in addition to the primary object? I'm going to click no and watch what happens. So now the only thing that actually has a 1 next to it is this prac trial list 1, because I pasted it and made a new copy of this file. Now, any changes I make to prac trial list aren't going to apply to my, prac trial list 1, sorry, aren't going to apply to my prac trial list, just to prac trial list 1, which again is exactly what I want. But the changes I make to color list and to fixation, stimulus, and feedback, if you notice, if you look at these things when I click on them, they're also being highlighted up here, which means this is the same instance, or this is a different instance of the same object. So any change I make to fixation in my critical proc here is going to change in my practice procedure. So I'm just referencing that object, and that's actually really great for computer processing time. So I do recommend doing that as often as possible in ePrime. But now I actually just want to change this prac trial list here, and I would just want to change it to trial list, because these are my actual trials in my experiment, not just the practice. So now that I've renamed my list object, I'm going to go ahead and change this stim word. And instead of all these X's, it's just going to be green, red, blue, or yellow, and blue. So now, this cross-section isn't necessarily going to be just the colors that's going to change. The color of the word color is going to change as well. And since I don't think 8 samples is good enough for critical trials, I'm going to change that too. And I'm going to change this from 8, and I want it to be 102 samples, or 120, sorry. To change that, we'll go ahead and click on the Properties page again. Click on the Reset Exit tab, and I'm going to change this from after 8 to after 30 cycles. So now ePrime is going to cycle through this 130 or 120 times. It'll pick green, and then what it'll do after it picks green is it's actually going to cycle through green, red, yellow, or blue and present that in a different color. Well, the one thing you should notice about this too is this sequential selection. This was okay whenever all I had were just these X's, and sequential selection in this case doesn't actually matter. But sequential selection here is going to matter. Participants are going to see green, the word green, the word yellow, or red, then the word yellow, and the word blue over and over and over again in that order. And again, that's going to start to become meaningless to participants, and they'll be able to anticipate what's going to happen next. So I want to change the sequential selection to random. So we'll click on the Properties page button here, click on Selection, and I'm going to change selection from sequential to random, and click Apply and OK. So now I'm going to get a random selection of green, red, yellow, and blue. I'm going to go ahead and run this just to make sure this works correctly, because that's actually all we need to change in order for this to work. So I'm going to do this windowed mode here, and I'm actually going to not run my practice proc. So I'm actually just going to uncheck these, and if you look here, if I uncheck these from this part of it, from the practice proc, it actually unchecks it from my trial proc. And I want to run these in my trial proc, so I'm going to keep it there. But if I uncheck practice trial list, it's not going to run any of these, and it'll just jump into my critical trial list. Let's go ahead and click test. I'm going to keep my data file at subject session 1. There's my instructions. And now red appears in red. Yellow appears in yellow. Green appears in green, and these are all just completely random. So eventually I'm going to get a mismatch of all of these. So green will appear in red, and I have to respond to red. Red will appear in yellow, I have to respond to yellow, and these are all just ePrime just completely randomly selecting all of these things from the cross-section of those two nested lists. And that looks like it's working exactly how I want. My feedback's functioning correctly. I did an incorrect response, so I got an incorrect response. I clicked on something correct, so I got it right, and if I let it time out, it's going to say no response detected. So, looks like my experiment's functioning wonderfully. So I'll go ahead and click abort. Would I like to abort the experiment? I'm going to click yes, and it was terminated, so I am good. Now the last thing I want to do in this experiment is I want to actually add an extra piece of data logging. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to tell me if the trial is congruent or incongruent. I'm going to add this because basically the crux of the Stroop experiment is that participants are more likely to respond faster to congruent stimuli, so is the word green written in green, than incongruent stimuli, is the word green written in red. And that's basically the Stroop effect in a nutshell. And right now, finding that in my data is going to be extremely difficult, because if I look at my data file, I don't actually have a column that says this trial is congruent, this trial is incongruent. I just have I just have the word and the word color, and I'll have to sit there afterwards and say congruent, incongruent for each and every trial. But we can make e' do that programmatically, so there's no need to do that afterwards. So let's go ahead and double click on the trial proc, and this is actually going to involve a little bit of inline script. I'm just going to be doing a very simple comparison of two attributes. So I'm actually going to take an inline object, and I'm going to put it just at the end of my feedback display here. The way that I like to name all of my e-objects, their name needs to reflect the function. The same with an inline object. I like the name of an inline object to reflect the script that's going to be inside it. So all I need to do is right click on it and rename it. So I right click and click rename, and I'm going to change this to check congruency and hit enter. I'm going to double click on it to open up my workspace, and what you see is just completely blank right now. I'm just going to write a very simple if-then statement. An if-then statement is a way for e' to say, if this criteria is met, do these things. So in this case, I'm going to make an if-then statement that takes a look at my stem color attribute. So right here in my color list, it's going to look at the stem color attribute, and it's going to do a comparison of that to my stem word attribute. If these two are identical, so if stem color is green and stem word is green, then I have a congruent trial. Otherwise, if stem word is green and stem color doesn't match green, if it's red, blue, or yellow, that's considered an incongruent trial. And I want to actually take that and encapsulate it in my script here. So I'll start off my if-then statement just with if, and then I have to reference that attribute. That attribute, the first one I'm going to reference is stem color. Now, to reference a stem color attribute in e' in script, you don't actually make these brackets and say stem color. This is incorrect and only works for any part of the graphical user interface that isn't an inline object. Instead of doing these square brackets, you have to wrap it with a call called c.getAttrib. And it's exactly what it sounds like. So I do c.getAttrib, and then instead of the square brackets, I have these quotation marks and these little parentheses here. So if c.getAttrib stem color, which is, again, the same way as writing stem color in those square brackets, but this is how you have to do it in script, if this is equal to the value of the attribute called color stem, or stem word, sorry. If that is equal to c, and I just do that c.getAttrib statement again. And if you notice, that attrib sense that happened earlier also appears in script. So I have stem color there. It needs to also be the same as stem word. So if these two things are congruent, so if stem color equals stem word, then I know I have a congruent trial on my hands. And I want to log that in my data file. I'm going to log that as an attribute called trial type. Now, in order to make an attribute, it's a little different than getting the value of one. Making one is using c.setAttrib instead of getAttrib. So I do c.setAttrib, the name of my attribute, which is going to be trial type. There we go, if I can actually spell that. And then you do a comma. Now, this part here, the c.getAttrib trial type, is exactly the same as going into a list object and making the header something. So changing the header of something in there, this is exactly the same. So I've now created a column, essentially in my data file, called trial type. And everything after this column is what I'm going to fill that in with. And in this case, I'm going to fill it in with the word congruent. Now, all I have to do is make another statement. This is called an else-if statement. So this is, if this is true, do these things, this if-then statement. And then this is like me saying, otherwise, do these things. So I just do else-if, and then I type in the logic for an incongruent trial. Else if c.getAttrib, and then this is going to be exactly the same. So instead of typing all of this out, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this. So I'm going to highlight all of this by copying it, and highlight this part and paste it. And I do need to change one thing. Right now, I have this operator in the middle that is a comparison operator if it's exactly the same. But I need to make sure that this is incongruent trial, so these don't match. So instead of having an equal sign as my operator, I need to do this. In E prime, this is a way of saying not equal to. So if stim color isn't the same as stim word, then that means I have an incongruent trial. So again, instead of typing all of that out, I'm actually just going to copy and paste it. So I'll highlight this, and I hit enter and tab, and then paste that. And now I know I have an incongruent trial. And then any end if or else if statement or if then statement that you have will end itself with an end if statement. And that's letting E prime know that it's done looking at stim color and stim word to get that trial type. And that's absolutely all I need to do in order to set that up correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and click save to save that. Now the one way to check to see if your script is correct is by clicking generate here. If you click generate, it actually checks for syntax errors. So it'll let you know syntactically is this correct. So a good example of a syntax error is, let's say I didn't actually include this end if statement here, and I just have my if and my else if. And if I click on this this generate button, what it's going to say is it encountered end sub, but it's expecting an else if or end if statement. And if you notice, the end if is actually what I deleted from this inline object. So it's saying, hey, I got to the end of the procedure here, and I'm looking for an end if statement, and I couldn't find an end if statement. I totally need an end if statement. So I'm going to click OK, and then just add that one back. So I'll do end if. And let's go ahead and run this quick, and we're going to check on that trial type attribute as it's logged to make sure that it works well. And I'm only going to check this one for my practice trial, or for my critical list. So let's go ahead and test. Keep subject and session the same. So my first trial is incongruent. This one is also an incongruent trial. I'm actually, whoops, I clicked the wrong button there. I actually clicked abort. I don't want to, so I'm going to keep going with my experiment there. This one is another incongruent, so I'm going to pause that one. And let's hop into my data file here. And we'll go ahead and try to find trial type. Now the reason it's not showing up just yet is because trial type isn't actually calculated yet. Trial type is calculated after I get to this part. So let's go ahead and resume this. And if you saw at the very end there, that's where my trial type was being calculated just before it moved on to the next part. So let's go ahead and just click abort to get out of this. Now since I couldn't see it come up in here, there is one easy way to check the trial type. And that's if I go to the folder where my experiment was made. So right now it was actually saved in that 3.0 folder. As you can see, I have quite a few files here, but the one that I do have is every time E prime runs, it actually makes these recovery.txt files. And for full data sets, you'll see that there's a txt file and there's actually an edat file, or an E prime data file. What I want to do is you can actually take those .txt files and turn them into genuine edat files. If you go to Tools and select eRecovery from the Tools menu here, I'm going to click Browse so I can find my data. There's my Stroop task data right there. I go ahead and double click on it and click Recover. And what it's going to do is it's going to say as many complete data records as possible were recovered. So basically, eRecovery can't guarantee that it's going to take a full set of data and give you a full set of data. It's just going to recover what it can. So I'm going to click OK to do that. Go ahead and close out of eRecovery, and now if I look in my folder, you're going to see that I now have a Stroop task edat file. So I'm specifically looking for that trial type attribute that I had made. So trial type here, it says incongruent, 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 incongruent. So all I need to do is take a look at stim word and that stim color. As you can see, these are pretty far apart. So what I can do is I can actually highlight all of these and hide them, which is one way to do it. Or I can click on this filter column here, remove all, and I'm actually just going to pick out what I want. So I'm going to alphabetize these so I know exactly where to find them. I'm going to add my trial type, and then I'm going to add stim color. And then the only other thing that I need is that stem word, which is right there. If I click OK, now I can double check that this is correct. So the stem color was blue, the word was red. That is an incongruent trial. My last one, which is congruent, is green and green. It looks like my inline is working perfectly. All right, so that is how to make a Stroop task from start to finish. We even threw in a little bit of inline script here. The one important thing that I want to mention about inline script is if you're writing an inline script, especially like this, it's important to have as many notes in it as possible. Right now there isn't really notes that say what it looks like or what this is doing or why I have this logic set up. It is important to make as many notes as possible, and you do that in script by just highlighting whatever row you want here and clicking on the apostrophe, and then everything, this will show up in green. But everything that shows up in green like that is actually considered a note in ePrime. It isn't processed like the rest of the script is. So I can literally type anything in here and it will just ignore this because it's only for design time. Now it's important to keep as many notes in these inline objects as possible in case you port this script over to something else. So let's say I really love the way that this script works and I need it in my other experiment. I can port that over and then I know exactly what it's doing. But it's also important for people in the future that take a look at your experiment in case they're not familiar with scripting. They can look at this and go, what is this even doing? And your notes are going to tell them exactly what to do. If you actually look at the sample, the Stroop sample in our experiment library, it has excellent notes in here, and it actually tells you line by line exactly what everything does. So it's a very valuable resource for determining how to use this script and how this script is interacting with the rest of the experiment. But aside from that, that's all the content that I have for today. Thank you guys so much for coming. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, have a great day.